In 1863, the small town of Willow Creek, Alabama, faced a mystery that would haunt families for generations. Every funeral held that summer featured the same disturbing sight. Two identical twin girls, no older than 8, standing at the back of every ceremony with matching white dresses and unnaturally wide smiles. No one knew who they were. No one remembered inviting them. And when townspeople tried to approach them after the services, the twins would simply vanish into thin air. But the most chilling part wasn't their sudden appearances or mysterious disappearances. It was what happened to the families they smiled at. The first sighting occurred on a sweltering July morning during the funeral of Margaret Henderson, the town baker's wife. Margaret had been known for her kindness, often giving free bread to families struggling through the harsh economic times of the Civil War. Her sudden death from consumption had shocked everyone in Willow Creek, and the entire town gathered to pay their respects to a woman who had fed their bodies and souls for over 2 decades. Reverend William Thorne had just finished reading the final prayer when Mrs. Agnes Blackwell noticed 2 small figures standing beneath the old oak tree at the cemetery's edge. The ancient oak had witnessed countless burials over the decades, its gnarled branches creating a natural canopy over the oldest section of the graveyard. But on this particular morning, something felt different about the shadows it cast. The twins wore identical white cotton dresses with high collars and long sleeves, completely inappropriate for the summer heat that had already soaked through the black mourning clothes of the other attendees. Their blonde hair was braided with white ribbons that seemed to catch light that wasn't there, creating an ethereal glow around their small faces. Their pale skin appeared almost translucent, as if they were made of morning mist rather than flesh and blood. What struck Mrs. Blackwell most was their expressions. While everyone else wept and mourned Margaret's passing, these children smiled with such intensity that it made her stomach turn. Their lips curved unnaturally wide, revealing teeth that seemed too white, too perfect, too sharp. Their eyes, pale blue like winter sky, never blinked as they watched the burial proceedings with an almost hungry fascination. Mrs. Blackwell later described their gaze as the way a cat watches a wounded bird, patient and predatory. The twins stood perfectly still, their hands clasped in front of them in a pose of mock reverence. No breeze disturbed their braids, no dust settled on their pristine white dresses, and no sweat beaded their foreheads despite the oppressive Alabama heat that had everyone else fanning themselves with prayer books and handkerchiefs. Mrs. Blackwell nudged her husband and whispered about the strange children, but when he turned to look, the twins had disappeared. She convinced herself it was grief playing tricks on her mind. Margaret Henderson had been like a sister to her, after all. The loss felt overwhelming, and perhaps her mind was creating strange visions to cope with the pain. But 3 days later, at the funeral of Thomas McCready, she saw them again. Thomas had been the town's blacksmith, a robust man in his 50s who had never been sick a day in his life until a fever took him in just 2 days. His sudden death sent ripples of fear through the community. If someone as strong as Thomas could be taken so quickly, none of them were safe. The funeral drew an even larger crowd than Margaret's, filled with people seeking comfort and reassurance that death wouldn't visit their families next. This time, the twins stood closer to the gathered mourners, positioned near the iron fence that separated the newer graves from the old section where Confederate soldiers lay buried. Their white dresses remained pristine despite the red Alabama dust that coated everything else, including the black shoes and dark clothing of the mourners. The fabric seemed to repel dirt and moisture, maintaining an otherworldly cleanliness that defied natural explanation. The same eerie smiles stretched across their faces as they watched Thomas's coffin being lowered into the ground. But now, other people began to notice them too. Children hid behind their parents' legs when they caught sight of the twins, instinctively sensing something wrong even if they couldn't articulate what it was. Dogs that had been brought to comfort grieving families began to whimper and pull away when their owners tried to lead them near the cemetery gates. Horses tied to the fence posts stamped their hooves nervously and rolled their eyes, showing the whites in fear. Young Samuel McCready, Thomas's 12-year-old grandson, later told his mother that the twins had been staring directly at him throughout the entire service. He said their smiles grew wider whenever he looked back at them, and their eyes seemed to follow him even when he moved to stand beside different family members. The boy described feeling cold inside whenever their gaze fell upon him, as if winter had somehow entered his chest and was freezing his heart from within. When Reverend Thorne spoke about Thomas's life and the legacy he left behind, Samuel noticed the twins tilt their heads in unison, as if they were listening to music only they could hear. Their expressions never changed from those disturbing smiles, not even when Thomas's widow began sobbing so hard that she collapsed against her son's shoulder. In fact, Samuel later swore that their smiles grew even wider when Mrs. McCready's grief reached its peak. When the service ended, Samuel worked up the courage to approach them, driven by the kind of morbid curiosity that only children possess. As he walked across the cemetery, his footsteps seemed unnaturally loud against the silence left by the departing mourners. But as he got within 10 feet of the twins, they simply faded away like morning mist touched by sunlight. One moment they were solid and present. The next they were translucent, and then they were gone entirely, leaving behind only 2 patches of withered grass where they had been standing. The third funeral that month belonged to elderly Mr. Jonathan Pike, the town's retired schoolmaster who had taught 2 generations of Willow Creek children to read and write. Jonathan's death wasn't unexpected. He was 83 and had been declining for months. But his passing marked the end of an era for the small town. He had been there linked to earlier, more prosperous times, and his death felt like losing a piece of their collective history. By now, word had spread about the mysterious twins, and half the town attended more out of curiosity than respect for the deceased. People whispered among themselves before the service, sharing theories about who the children might be and what their presence meant. Some suggested they were distant relatives of the deceased, while others wondered if they might be the spirits of children who had died in the recent cholera outbreak that had claimed several young lives the previous year. The twins appeared exactly as before, wearing their white dresses and displaying those unsettling smiles. They stood beneath the same oak tree, their small hands folded in the same pose of false piety. But this time, something different happened. The air around them seemed to shimmer like heat waves rising from sun-baked stones, and several witnesses later reported that the twins cast no shadows despite the bright afternoon sun. Mrs. Eleanor Pike, Jonathan's daughter-in-law, was a practical woman who had no patience for superstition or nonsense. She had married into the Pike family from Boston and brought with her northern sensibilities about confronting problems directly rather than whispering about them in corners. Seeing the strange children at her father-in-law's funeral filled her with indignation rather than fear. She marched across the cemetery with determined steps, her black mourning dress rustling against the dry grass that hadn't seen rain in weeks. As she approached, the twins' smiles grew impossibly wider, stretching their lips until it looked painful. The skin at the corners of their mouths began to crack like dried leather, but no blood emerged. Only darkness, as if their mouths were openings into an endless void. Mrs. Pike called out to them, demanding to know who they were and why they kept appearing at funerals. Her voice echoed strangely in the humid air, as if the sound was being absorbed by something unseen. The twins tilted their heads in perfect unison, like curious birds studying an insect they planned to devour. Their pale blue eyes seemed to grow lighter as she approached, until they were almost white, like holes cut in paper. Then, in voices that sounded like wind chimes made of ice, they spoke their first and only words that anyone ever heard. "We collect the sorrow." The words seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, resonating not just in the air, but inside the bones and hearts of everyone present. Several people later said they felt the phrase settle into their chests like cold stones, weighing them down with a sadness that wasn't entirely their own. Before Mrs. Pike could respond or demand further explanation, the children began to fade. But unlike their previous disappearances, this time they dissolved slowly, starting from their feet and working upward like sugar dissolving in water. Their white dresses became translucent first, revealing glimpses of what lay beneath. not the bodies of children, but swirling masses of gray mist shot through with threads of silver that might have been tears made solid. Their faces remained visible until the very last moment, those impossible smiles hanging in the air like the grin of the Cheshire Cat before finally disappearing entirely. But even after they were gone, the impression of their presence lingered, as if they had left invisible fingerprints on the very air itself. If you're finding this story as disturbing as we are, make sure to subscribe because the mystery of Willow Creek only gets darker from here. We post new haunting tales every week that will keep you awake at night. That evening, Mrs. Pike began experiencing strange dreams that felt more real than her waking hours. She found herself standing in an endless cemetery filled with tombstones that bore her family's names, not just her husband and children, but relatives who wouldn't be born for decades. Names she had never heard but somehow recognized as her own blood. The tombstones stretched to the horizon in perfect rows, each one carved from the same white stone that seemed to glow with its own inner light. In the distance, she could see the twin girls walking among the graves, their white dresses billowing in a wind she couldn't feel. They moved with purpose, stopping at certain graves to kneel and place their small hands on the headstones. Each time they touched a marker, it would pulse with pale light, and Mrs. Pike could hear whispered voices rising from the earth below, the voices of the dead sharing their final moments, their deepest regrets, their most profound sorrows. Each time she tried to run toward them or away from them, her feet felt like they were stuck in thick mud that seemed to be made of congealed tears. The twins would turn to look at her with those same terrifying smiles, and she would wake up screaming, her nightgown soaked with perspiration that smelled faintly of grave dirt and withered flowers. The dreams continued for weeks, becoming more vivid and disturbing each night. Mrs. Pike began to waste away, losing weight and refusing to eat. She would sit at her dining room table, staring at plates of food that seemed to turn to ash in her mouth. Her husband found her one morning standing in their back garden at dawn, still in her nightgown, staring at nothing with tears streaming down her face. The tears were cold to the touch, and when they hit the ground, the grass beneath them withered and died. When he asked what was wrong, she whispered, "They're coming for all of us." The twins are collecting our family's sorrow, and they won't stop until they have it all. She spoke in a monotone voice that didn't sound entirely like her own, as if someone else was using her vocal cords to deliver a message. Mrs. Pike wasn't the only one affected. Samuel McCready started having nightmares about the twins visiting his bedroom at night. In these dreams, they would stand at the foot of his bed, their white dresses luminescent in the darkness, their smiles wide enough to split their faces in half. They would whisper to him about his grandfather, telling him secrets about where Thomas had really gone after death and what waited for all living souls in the darkness beyond the grave. Samuel would wake to find muddy footprints on his floor that led to his window, even though his room was on the second floor and there was no tree or ladder nearby. The footprints were small and delicate, exactly the size that would be left by two 8-year-old girls, but they were made of mud that contained things that shouldn't have been there, fragments of bone, withered flower petals, and what looked like crystallized tears. His mother discovered him one night sleepwalking toward the cemetery, moving through the darkness with the confident steps of someone who could see clearly despite the moonless night. When she woke him, he was sobbing uncontrollably, saying the twins had promised to show him where his grandfather really went. He spoke of a place beneath the cemetery where all the sorrow of the world gathered like water in a deep well, and how the twins swam through those tears like fish through water. Mrs. Agnes Blackwell, the first person to notice the twins, began seeing them in mirrors. At first, it was just glimpses, a flash of white dress in her peripheral vision, a brief reflection of blonde braids behind her own image. But as the days passed, the sightings became more frequent and more distinct. She would catch clear images of the twins standing just behind her reflection, their smiles growing wider each time she looked. The most disturbing aspect was that the twins in the mirrors seemed to be aware of being watched. They would wave at her with their small white hands, and their mouths would move as if they were speaking, though no sound came through the glass. Sometimes they would press their faces against the surface from the other side, their breath fogging the mirror from within in a way that defied all logic. Mrs. Blackwell stopped using mirrors altogether, covering every reflective surface in her house with black cloth. But the twins found other ways to appear, in windows at night, in the surface of water basins, even in the polished silver of her grandmother's tea service. No matter how many reflective surfaces she eliminated, they always found new ones, as if they were creating their own doorways between their realm and hers. The town's physician, Dr. Marcus Webb, initially dismissed these accounts as mass hysteria brought on by grief and the stress of living through wartime. He had seen similar cases of collective delusion in his medical journals, instances where entire communities convinced themselves they were experiencing supernatural phenomena when the truth was far more mundane. But his skepticism changed when the twins appeared at his own father's funeral in August. Dr. Webb's father had been the town's previous doctor, a man who had delivered half the babies in Willow Creek and tended to the sick through 3 different epidemic outbreaks. His death represented not just a personal loss for Dr. Webb, but a professional one for the entire community. The funeral drew people from 3 neighboring towns, all of whom had been helped by the elder Dr. Webb at some point in their lives. Dr. Webb was a man of science, educated in Philadelphia and trained to observe details with clinical precision. He positioned himself where he could watch the twins throughout the entire service, noting every detail about their appearance and behavior. He observed their unnatural stillness. In 30 minutes of observation, he never saw them shift their weight, scratch an itch, or make any of the small, unconscious movements that living beings make constantly. He noted that shadows seemed to bend around them rather than fall upon them, creating pockets of darkness that didn't match the angle of the sun. Most unnervingly, he realized that while everyone else's breathing was visible in small puffs due to the morning's unusual coolness, no such condensation appeared around the twins' faces. They either weren't breathing, or their breath was the same temperature as the surrounding air. After the burial, Dr. Webb approached the spot where the twins had been standing, bringing his medical bag with the intention of conducting a thorough investigation. The ground was ice cold, despite the August heat that had everyone else sweating through their formal clothes. No grass grew in 2 small circular patches where their feet had been, and the earth there was packed hard as stone, as if it had been compressed by enormous weight over many years. He collected soil samples and examined them under his microscope that evening, finding something that defied explanation. The dirt contained what appeared to be human tears, crystallized into tiny, sharp fragments that cut his fingers when he handled them. Under magnification, the crystals showed complex internal structures that resembled snowflakes, but with patterns that seemed to shift and change as he watched them. Dr. Webb began documenting every detail about the twins' appearances, creating a detailed file that he hoped might eventually explain the phenomenon through scientific means. He noted that they never seemed to age, breathe, or blink. Their dresses never wrinkled or showed wear despite appearing at funeral after funeral throughout the summer and into fall. The fabric seemed to exist in a permanent state of newness, as if it had just been sewn by invisible hands moments before each appearance. Most importantly, he observed that families who had direct contact with the twins, those who were smiled at most intensely or who tried to approach them, began experiencing what he termed sorrow sickness. The condition presented with consistent symptoms across different families, suggesting that whatever the twins were, their effect on human physiology was measurable and predictable. The affected families showed similar symptoms that progressed in stages. First came the dreams about endless cemeteries and impossible graveyards filled with graves of people they had never met, but somehow mourned. Then they began to see the twins in reflective surfaces, shadows, and peripheral vision. Children would wake up crying about visits from the pretty ladies in white who whispered about joining them in their games that involved dancing on graves and singing lullabies to the dead. Adults found themselves drawn to the cemetery at odd hours, often with no memory of how they got there. They would be found by family members or neighbors, standing among the graves with tears streaming down their faces, unable to explain why they were crying or what had brought them to that place. Some reported feeling as if they were being pulled by invisible strings, compelled to visit the graves of people they had never known, but whose stories of loss somehow felt intimately familiar. As summer turned to autumn, the twins' behavior began to change in ways that filled Dr. Webb with growing dread. Instead of simply standing at the edge of funeral services, they started moving closer to the mourners, weaving between the gathered families like shepherds moving through a flock. Their smiles became even more pronounced, stretching beyond what should have been physically possible, and witnesses reported hearing soft giggling that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The sound was described as being like children playing in a distant room, but with an underlying tone that made listeners feel deeply uneasy. Dr. Webb, with his trained ear, recognized harmonics in the laughter that shouldn't have been possible from human vocal cords. The giggling contained frequencies that seemed to resonate directly with the inner ear, bypassing normal hearing and vibrating through the bones of the skull. The breaking point came in late September during the funeral of young Martha Sinclair, who had died of fever at just 16 years old. Martha had been beloved by everyone in Willow Creek, known for her beautiful singing voice and her kindness to anyone in need. She had been planning to marry young David Thompson in the spring, and her death devastated not just her immediate family, but the entire tight-knit community that had watched her grow up. The funeral drew the largest crowd anyone could remember, with people traveling from neighboring towns to pay their respects to a girl who had brought light and joy into so many lives. The church couldn't hold everyone, so the service was moved to the cemetery itself, where people gathered around Martha's gravesite in concentric circles that extended far beyond the cemetery gates. The twins appeared as usual, but this time they stood directly among the mourners rather than at their customary distance. They positioned themselves on either side of Martha's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Robert Sinclair, who were too consumed by grief to notice the strange children beside them. The twins' presence seemed to intensify the sorrow of everyone around them, drawing out deeper levels of pain than even Martha's death alone could explain. Throughout the service, the twins' smiles grew wider and wider as they absorbed the intense sorrow surrounding Martha's coffin. Dr. Webb, watching from his position near the back of the crowd, noted that the air around the twins began to shimmer like heat waves, and he could swear he saw wisps of gray mist rising from the mourners and flowing toward the two girls like smoke drawn up a chimney. When Reverend Thorne began reading the final blessing, both twins suddenly turned to look directly at him. Their smiles stretched beyond what should have been physically possible, revealing not just teeth, but what appeared to be endless darkness beyond. The Reverend's voice faltered as he met their gaze, and several witnesses later claimed the temperature dropped so dramatically that their breath became visible in the September heat. As Martha's coffin was lowered into the ground, the twins began to fade, but not all at once like before. They dissolved slowly, starting from their feet and working upward, as if they were melting or being absorbed into the earth itself. But their faces remained visible until the very last moment. Those impossible smiles hanging in the air above the gravesite before finally vanishing with a sound like sighing wind that seemed to carry whispered words in languages no one recognized. That night, every person who had attended Martha's funeral experienced the same dream. They found themselves in a vast white room filled with mirrors, each reflection showing a different moment of loss from their lives. The twins moved between the mirrors like shepherds tending a flock, collecting teardrops in crystal vials that hung from white ribbons around their necks. In the dream, everyone understood that the twins weren't malevolent spirits seeking to harm the living. They were something far more disturbing, collectors who fed on human sorrow, gathering the deepest grief and pain to sustain themselves. The dreams revealed the twins' true nature and origin. They had once been living children, sisters named Emma and Grace Whitmore, who died in a house fire during the winter of 1855. Their parents' overwhelming grief and the town's collective sorrow over such a senseless tragedy had somehow prevented the girls from moving on to whatever comes after death. Instead, they became trapped in a state between life and death, sustained only by feeding on the same type of profound sadness that had created them. But here's what the townspeople didn't realize until it was too late. Each time the twins collected sorrow, they grew stronger, and stronger twins meant they could appear at more than just funerals. By October, people began seeing them at weddings, standing in the back with their eternal smiles, waiting for moments of loss within celebrations. They appeared at birthday parties for elderly people, knowing that each year brought families closer to inevitable goodbyes. They materialized during harvest festivals, their presence a reminder that winter and death always follow the abundance of autumn. The twins had evolved beyond simply attending sorrowful events. They had learned to create them. Mrs. Eleanor Pike was found dead in her garden on a cold October morning, her body arranged in a perfect circle of crystallized tears that had somehow grown from the earth around her like deadly flowers. Samuel McCready disappeared entirely, leaving behind only muddy footprints that led from his bedroom window to the cemetery, and then simply stopped at Martha Sinclair's grave, as if he had been absorbed into the earth itself. Dr. Webb's detailed research notes were discovered scattered across his office, each page marked with small handprints that appeared to be made of ice. His final observations described the twins as evolutionary anomalies in the realm of death, predators that have adapted to feed on the emotional energy released by profound loss. He theorized that they were growing stronger with each feeding, eventually becoming powerful enough to manufacture the very sorrow they consumed. By winter, Willow Creek had become a town where joy was impossible and sorrow was a living thing that followed families like a shadow. The twins no longer needed to wait for natural deaths and genuine grief. They had learned to cultivate these emotions, appearing wherever happiness tried to take root and smiling until that happiness withered and died like plants touched by frost. Children stopped playing in the streets, sensing danger they couldn't articulate. Couples postponed weddings indefinitely, afraid that celebrating love would somehow invoke the twins' presence. Even Christmas was observed with subdued reverence rather than joy, as if the entire town was holding its breath, waiting for the next tragedy to unfold. But the most terrifying discovery came when Reverend Thorne found the church registry from 1855. Listed among the deaths from the house fire were indeed two sisters, Emma and Grace Whitmore, ages 7 and 8. But according to the records, their bodies were never recovered from the burned ruins of their home. The graves in Willow Creek Cemetery marked as theirs contained only empty coffins, buried to give the grieving parents some sense of closure. The twins had never been properly laid to rest, which meant they had never truly died. They existed in a state of perpetual mourning for their own lives, feeding on others' grief to fill the void where their own deaths should have been. And as long as sorrow existed in Willow Creek, the twins would continue to smile at every funeral, every goodbye, every moment of human loss. The last documented sighting of the twins occurred in December 1863, at what should have been a Christmas celebration. The town had attempted to restore some semblance of normalcy by holding their traditional winter festival in the town square, complete with carolers, hot cider, and gifts for the children. But as evening fell and snow began to drift down from the darkening sky, witnesses reported seeing two girls in white dresses standing at the edge of the town square. Their smiles were visible even in the falling snow, glowing like lanterns in the gathering darkness. But this time, they weren't alone. Behind them stood dozens of other figures, all the people who had disappeared over the past months, including Mrs. Pike, Samuel McCready, and Dr. Webb. All wore the same unnaturally wide smiles and blank, staring eyes that seemed to look through the world of the living into something far more distant and terrible. The townspeople of Willow Creek realized they hadn't been dealing with just two spirits collecting sorrow. They had been feeding an entire army of the grief-consumed dead, and now that army was ready to expand beyond the borders of their small Alabama town. The gathered spirits stood in perfect formation, like soldiers awaiting orders, their white clothing luminescent against the dark winter sky. The last entry in Dr. Webb's research journal, written in handwriting that grew increasingly erratic, contained just 4 words: "They're teaching others to smile." The page was signed with 2 small handprints made of what appeared to be frozen tears, and beneath them, someone had drawn a simple map showing roads leading out of Willow Creek toward every major city in the South. By spring 1864, Willow Creek was a ghost town, its surviving residents scattered to distant relatives or new settlements far from Alabama. But travelers passing through the area began reporting strange sightings. Twin girls in white dresses appearing at funerals throughout Georgia, Mississippi, and Tennessee, always smiling their impossible smiles and always collecting the sorrow of the bereaved. Some say they're still out there, moving from town to town, gathering grief and recruiting the lost souls of those who loved too deeply and mourned too long. And if you ever find yourself at a funeral where two young girls in white dresses are standing in the back with smiles too wide for their faces, remember this story from Willow Creek. Because the twins who smile at funerals aren't there to pay their respects to the dead. They're there to collect something far more precious and terrible than you could ever imagine.